So hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the 14th installment of the U.S.-Asia Institute's webinar series, Northeast Asia in Focus. For those of you that have attended our events before, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to USAI, thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Earls, and I am Program Manager here at the U.S.-Asia Institute. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 45-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the US and Asia. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders, SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Fairfield Maxwell, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and FedEx for helping to make this program possible. Additionally, all attendees should be aware that today's event will be on the record, recorded, and uploaded to the USAI YouTube channel. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your camera turned off throughout the speaker presentations. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to type it in the chat box or wait to say your question during the Q&A session that we'll have at the end. Now, moving on to today's program. Today's discussion will be led by Dr. Robert Sutter, Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He has published 22 books, 4 of which with multiple editions, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relationships with the US. Dr. Sutter's government career saw service in roles such as Senior Specialist and Director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, and the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the US government's National Intelligence Council, among more roles. And we are very fortunate to have him with us today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Professor, to introduce today's fellow panelists and to begin our discussion.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That's very nice of you to do that. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you all today and to discuss these important matters. And really, I have about 5 minutes to make an introductory remark, and I'd like to do that if I can, because this is a Washington event, and particularly on Capitol Hill, you want to address the policy implications for the United States. And so I'd like to just make a few points on that by way of context so that we can follow that as we go on in today's discussion. The context is really the U.S. hardening toward China involving 6 years of bipartisan congressional majorities and the Republican and Democratic administrations taking countermeasures to defend America from very serious challenges posed by Chinese government behavior. Against this background, U.S. media and non-government policy elites have repeatedly warned over the last 4 years of the dangerous shortcomings in U.S. policy dealing with Taiwan. The latter trend began when the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, as you may remember, made an argument strongly saying that we needed strategic clarity rather than strategic ambiguity in order to dissuade an aggressive and very powerful China from attacking Taiwan. This was almost 4 years ago. The warnings intensified with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and growing awareness that China could do the same with Taiwan. They reached a fever pitch, as you may remember, when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August of that year, resulting in 4 days of Chinese military shows of force around Taiwan Island. So the elections in Taiwan this weekend mark the latest stage in this long string of sometimes alarming assessments. And those assessments had some characteristics. They focused heavily on the danger of possible Chinese attack and resulting war involving the United States. The reasons China would attack focused on China's enormous military advantage over Taiwan and President Xi Jinping's heightened determination to unify the island by force if necessary. Related circumstances had to do with Taiwan's identity, separate from China, supporting moves toward independence, and Biden administration and Congress pursuing numerous incremental advances supporting Taiwan against China. Confident of its strength, Beijing was seen waiting for an opportunity to apply decisive force to compel unification. Those seeing China facing future decline in economic power saw the danger as now. before China would attack now before China loses strategic advantage. The majority of the complaints focused on the U.S. not doing enough to deter China and defend Taiwan. But critical comment on the Pelosi visit and recent U.S. government advances in military and other cooperation with Taiwan have argued for greater U.S. restraint and more U.S. efforts to reassure China of U.S. intentions regarding Taiwan. In the end, the commentary did not appear to significantly change U.S. policy. And so one of the questions to be considered today is, should U.S. policy shift following the Taiwan elections? And if so, how should it shift? So we're very fortunate today to have two of the leading world experts on these kinds of issues. And the order of our program has Russell Hsiao going first. And so I just want to introduce Russell, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Rigger, and then we'll start with Russell's presentation. Russell Hsiao is currently the executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute, a Washington-based think tank focusing exclusively on Taiwan policy research and related programs. He is concurrently a fellow at the Jamestown Foundation and an adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. Professor Rigger, Shelley Rigger, is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and a professor of East Asian politics at Davidson College. She's the author of 4 books about Taiwan, most recently The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. So I'll first call on Russell, and then we will have Shelley make her presentation, and then we'll have some questions and comments from the audience. So Russell, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sutter, and allow me to express my appreciation to Amanda as well as the U.S. Asia Institute for convening this very timely and important conversation, and allowing me to be able to share this virtual stage with both you and Professor Rigger, really distinguished scholars in this field of Taiwan policy and Taiwan studies that. Whose work and reports and books have really had a indelible impact in my understanding of these issues. And of course, any analytical judgments that I make are faults of my own. So in terms of the observations that I make here today, what I hope to do is provide some more sort of details and nuance into the just held elections to help hopefully illuminate some of the trend lines that I see coming ahead as a result of these elections. And hopefully in the discussion, we can tease out how they may impact some of the implications, policy implications that were underscored in Professor Sutter's excellent backdrop to the broader policy debates that are ongoing concerning Taiwan. First, let me just make some very quick, very general observation about Taiwan's democracy and what these elections indicate. First of all, it underscores the robustness of Taiwan's democracy. With a voter participation rate of 72% of registered voters, it continues to be the envy of any democracy to have that level of voter participation in these elections. And secondly, is that there were no major irregularities detected in these elections, despite some rumor mongering, which are being dealt with through sort of procedural processes within that electoral system. There were no major irregularities detected in the elections. I think overall it was a very free and fair elections, and I think it attests also to the fact that it is a maturing democracy. All the opposition candidates that failed to clinch the presidential election conceded, in a timely fashion, and I think this process, also underscores the integrity of the democratic system in Taiwan remains firmly intact. So those are some very just sort of outlaying points here. Now let me move on to some of the more specific observations or important features that I identified as a result from this election. The first feature is that it certainly is unprecedented that this is the first time in Taiwan's democratic history that the voters delivered 3 consecutive terms to a party, and I think with the 40% obtained by the DPP's candidate Lai Ching-te over the 33% obtained by the KMT's candidate, and then a third party challenger in the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, at 26%. This does, I think, overall represent, in terms of the voters' preference, a preference for maintaining the status quo and the continuity in the national policies undertaken by the current and the current DPP ruling government. However, I think it's worthwhile diving into some of the trend lines for these results to gain some more perspectives as to what they mean. So while it is sure that this is unprecedented in terms of the voters' support or the preference of the DPP's policies, or the preference for the continuity over the opposition candidates, if you compare this to the 2020 presidential election, where the DPP's candidate then Tsai Ing-wen had 57% of the votes, compared to the KMT, the opposition party's 38%. This is a very wide different margin than the victory that was just obtained by the DPP in this most recent election, which was only a spread of about 7% compared to about 19% in the prior elections. And so what we're seeing here, I think, and what it suggests to me is that this is a much weaker mandate for the incoming DPP administration. I think there are several factors that contribute to this result, and that and part of it has to do with natural incumbency fatigue with regards to the ruling party's administration of both the executive branch and the legislative branch of the government for the past 8 years. And while this does not, this incumbency fatigue ultimately did not impact the results of the presidential election, I think we saw that it played out to some degree in the legislative UN elections. A final point I would make about the presidential election before moving on to the legislative UN elections is that I think this perhaps also reflects less about the attractiveness of the DPP policies than perhaps more in terms of it reflected more in terms of the failure of the opposition parties, the KMT and the TPP, of being able to offer a compelling alternative to the ruling party's candidates and policy platforms. And we can get into a bit more conversation and details about that in our discussion later with regards to the policies that were offered by the varying political parties. Now, moving on to my second more specific observation, and this relates to the legislative yuan, the parliamentary elections in Taiwan, that I think also represents another first, and certainly at least since 2004, and that is, this is the first time that the legislative body is not controlled by a majority from a single political party. Now, in this race, the opposition party, the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, the KMT, gained 52 seats, which is a very razor edge sort of edge over the DPP, which obtained 51 seats, and that compared to 8 seats, a very decisive 8 seats, if you will, for the Taiwan People's Party, and again, that's the party headed by the former Taipei City Mayor Ko Wen-je. I think looking at these numbers alone, it does, indicate that there will be a split, sort of legislative branch, which of course would make governing more complex and challenging. I think for those of you, working for, in Congress, understands and appreciates this issue, I think profoundly, and understanding how that process works. And I think in some ways it's important to also indicate to highlight that this, while the DPP was successful in clinching the presidential race, it lost substantially here in the legislative races, losing 10 seats from what it held back in 2020 up to 2024. So dropping from 61 to 51, and then with the KMT gaining a total of 14 seats from its prior 38 to 54, and of course with the TPP gaining of around 3 seats from its prior elections. And so if we look even back further from the 2016 race, which is when the DPP administration first came back into power with the election of President Tsai, where it gained 68 seats, where it won 68 seats. So you can see that this has been a gradual decline in the representation of the ruling administration. And as a result, I think, we can see that trend that trend continue onwards, and this has, I think, also some implications in terms of future elections and where that might where things may be going in the future. And so this highlights, I think, suggests a very important element, which is the importance of this third party now, the TPP, as a decisive sort of swing party that can really be determinative of any policy, legislations, since in the context of Taiwan, as in most legislative bodies, that it controls appropriations and budgetary processes that will be critical to implementing successfully implementation of any policy initiatives that will be undertaken by the incoming administration. And I think that means that there will be, of course, a lot more necessity for coalition building. And I think if you just look in terms of the numbers, with the KMT commanding 52 seats, and if you look at the Pan-Blue coalition, meaning those more aligned with it, there's 2 additional independent candidate seats there that align more with the KMT. So you're looking at 54 seats. You only need about 57 votes in order to make a decisive to make it to control the decision. And as such, this TPP with 8 seats really is a pretty significant, will be a significant player in the governance process of in the incoming administration. And the third specific observation that I will make is, and it somewhat also speaks to, I think, an unprecedented nature of this electoral cycle, and that is the scale and scope of the CCP's influence and interference activities into these in an attempt to influence and affect the elections in Taiwan. And these activities range from more of the traditional methods of military and gray zone coercion to economic coercion, to united front activities, the use of party and state as well as front organizations in an effort to co-opt and influence voters in Taiwan. The rampant and use of information and disinformation campaigns to pollute the information space within Taiwan, to cloud the judgments and efforts by the population to have a more I think deeper and clear understanding of the policies and issues in the debate, to cyber and intelligence operations. It really covers the gamut in terms of the level of coordination that could be seen from this election. And I just want to highlight here perhaps sort of three of these elements in terms of what was noteworthy in what it may portend in the years to come as Vice President-elect Lai Ching-te will assume the presidency in May 20th of this year. The first of which I think is Beijing has clearly shown its intention of how it plans to deal with the incoming Lai administration very clearly. It's worth remembering that in 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen was just elected, it took 2 months for Beijing to fire the first salvo in its renewed diplomatic offensive campaign against Taiwan by establishing diplomatic ties with Gambia. Now, fast forward to 2024, it took less than 2 days after the election of Lai Ching-te for Beijing to establish diplomatic ties with Nauru, Pacific Island nation. In addition to that, there are very authoritative and explicit indication from General Secretary Xi Jinping himself in broadening out and deepening the CCP's United Front and influence activities vis-a-vis Taiwan, the use of pseudo civil society organizations, party apparatuses, to engage sympathetic elements within Taiwan's population through use of proxy organizations and proxy political parties to influence the political conditions within Taiwan. And that includes not only the co-optation of sympathizers and allies, but also isolation of so-called secessionists and independence advocates within Taiwanese society, of which the PRC views the ruling DPP administration as such. And thirdly, I think the economic coercion part will be a major element in going forward in the PRC's toolbox focused on Taiwan. Now, the combination of economic coercion and enticements have always been part of the sort of playbook with regards to how the PRC approaches Taiwan, its strategy towards Taiwan. But clearly in the past 4 years already, we've seen an intensification of these efforts to include a very systematic series of arbitrary import bans of agricultural products and other food groups from Taiwan entering into China, in order to impact both, the sort of the local elections that were held 2 years ago, but also, in the lead up to the national election that was just held, in which just of last year, the Chinese authorities had announced a sweeping investigation of over 2,000, close to 2,500 products, of which it alleged that Taiwan had violated trade agreements with China on, and therefore it was conducting an investigation to determine whether these were in violation and thereby take retaliatory action. This investigation was clearly timed. It had an end date basically that was allowed to extend just right up to the day before Taiwan's election was held, and in the month, just a month prior and leading up to the elections, there were official determination made that that Taiwan had violated those terms and agreements, and then subsequently the PRC announced several measures of several products that they were going to then remove any tariff reductions that were authorized as a result of the prior agreements. And so there's a host of other types of these types of measures that certainly the PRC can take. Another example I would just add before I think turning it over to Professor Rigger in terms of these measures was, which was a successful sidelining of the independent candidate, Terry Guo, who had originally ran in the opposition party's primary, but failed to be selected through an internal election and selection process that ultimately led to the selection of Hou Youyi, the new Taipei city mayor, as the KMT's candidate, but then subsequently, months later, had announced that he was running as an independent. And following his announcement of his independent candidacy, the Chinese government then announced that it was going to perform a tax audit of the company that he founded, which is Foxconn, a very massive technology company with heavy footprints in the PRC, and subsequently he had withdrawn from the race. And so I think looking at these tools and tactics in totality, I think going forward, I think these are going to be issues and areas that will need to be watched carefully, and happy to get into more in terms of the implications of these elections on both for Taiwan's domestic politics as well as for cross-strait relations in the discussion. So with that, let me just turn it back to Professor Sutter.
I can't get myself unmuted. Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. This is great. Thank you very much, Russell. That was a very thorough assessment of the implications of the elections, particularly looking at the situation inside Taiwan, but as well as looking at China. Very important findings. Shelley, I think it's now your turn. Professor Rigger, please.
All right, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to discussion and some questions. So I think Russell Xiao has covered the ground really well. So I'm just going to make a handful of additional points and let us move on to some Q&A, because there are some good questions in the chat. So the first thing I would just say is that on the sort of big question of who got what in this election, and what does this election say about the state of play with respect to the popularity of different political parties and their positions, it's very hard to draw real strong conclusions out of these results. So the DPP, KMT, TPP split in the presidential vote of 40%, 33%, 22%. is not the same as the split in other elections that were held at the same time. So if we look at the proportional or party list vote for the legislature, so Taiwan's legislature has two kinds of seats. It has district seats and it has party list proportional representation seats. In the district seat, you're voting for a candidate from your local district. In the PR seats or the party list, you're just voting for a party name. And the parties assign people to those seats in order, and they get the number of seats that their proportion of the vote allows, and they fill those seats with the people from their respective lists. So the DPP got 40% of the presidential vote, but 36% of the PR vote. The KMT got 33% of the presidential vote, but 35% of the PR vote. And the TPP did the same in both 22 and 22. So if we look at the PR vote as a kind of rough measure of parties' popularity as parties, it looks like the DPP and KMT are effectively tied, and that the TPP has about 20% popularity. But then if we look at the district seats, the DPP did way better. The DPP actually got 45% of the vote in the legislative district elections overall. The KMT had 40%, and only 3% of voters selected TPP candidates for their party or their district seats. And so what that suggests is that where voters knew that the TPP had no chance, they kind of abandoned the TPP. And that abandonment seems to have worked a little bit more to the DPP's advantage than to the KMT. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. One of the questions in the chat is, if there had been no third-party candidate, who would have benefited from those votes? That is a very tough call to make right now in view of the data we have available. It will be more, it will become clearer over time as new polls come out where people are explicitly asked that question. But just based on the district candidates, it seems to me that there were a non-trivial portion of DPP voters who seem to have, they voted for DPP candidates in their districts, but not for the DPP presidential candidate. But that is also true for the KMT. So it seems like at first blush, I would say the TPP took votes from both of the other two parties. Exactly in what measure is hard to say. Something else that emerges from looking at the district voting is that despite the fact that Taiwan doesn't really have gerrymandering in the way that we have gerrymandering in the US, the way the districts are drawn, which conforms to administrative subunits of the island, so they're not strictly based on population. So there is some disproportionality because every subunit of the island gets at least one district. And that means that very small ones, actually, there are fewer people in the district than there are in the districts that are divided in larger municipalities that are divided into districts. And as a result, despite getting 45% of the vote to the KMT's 40% in these district elections, the DPP got fewer district seats, only 38 district seats to the KMT's 39. So disproportionality worked against the DPP in a kind of very marginal way in this election. Okay, another question that just popped up in the chat. What is the percentage of people who did not vote? The one thing that's very interesting about Taiwan is that there's no actual registration. All eligible voters are automatically registered. So 72% turnout means that of all of the people who were eligible to vote in Taiwan, 72% of them voted, which is incredibly high. I don't know the answer to the second part of your question. Is that correlated to any interesting other variables that we might look at? So what we ended up with then is exactly as Russell described, a weak presidential mandate, right? A president with a minority of the vote, 40%. And not only divided government, but actually a hung parliament, right? A parliament in which no political party has a majority. And this, I think, really raises a very interesting question and possibility for the future. You know, what is going to happen in the legislature? One possibility is, as Russell suggested, that the TPP will side with the KMT. Many of the TPP's supporters, candidates, and so on have leaned toward the KMT in the past. The top person on the TPP's party list, Huang Shanshan, has been in the new party and has worked for the KMT prior to joining the TPP. So she's affiliated with the blue camp historically. So there's good reason to believe that the TPP will align with the KMT. But there's another really intriguing possibility that I really hope the TPP will consider, which is to align with the DPP and to give the DPP a governing, a slim but nonetheless effective governing majority, if not on all issues through a formal coalition, then at least on some issues through issue by issue cooperation. The advantage for the TPP in doing that is that they would then be part of a coalition that's actually governing in collaboration with the executive function through the presidential office and the premier, rather than aligning themselves with a KMT, which puts them in opposition to the executive leadership and gives them mainly an obstructionist role in government. So if they can persuade the DPP to give them some space on some of the issues that are important to them, which are primarily domestic issues. These are the issues they campaigned on. These are the things that are exciting to their voters. They may actually be able to put some of their ideas into law through a coalition or cooperation with the DPP. The DPP, I think, will be willing to make some interesting offers to the TPP in order to pull them on side. One possibility certainly is some cabinet positions. Another possibility that might be of particular strategic value would be to allow Huang Shanshan, the TPP's top legislator, to be the speaker of the legislature. That's an important post, and it would be a very tempting opportunity, I think, for legislator Huang. And it has the potential, and this might be strategically useful to the DPP, of splitting the TPP. Ko Wen-je, the presidential candidate, would like to be the kingmaker. You know, he'd like to be in charge. But Huang Shanshan is a very important and high-impact politician in her own right. And the DPP might be able to elevate her role in her own party and de-elevate Ko Wen-je's role by giving her something really good to do in the legislature, possibly even the speaker. So there's a lot of, that's all by way of saying there's just a lot of possibilities, and it's very hard to forecast exactly how this is all going to land. One final point, what should the US watch for? And here I'm going to go back to Professor Sutter's, Bob Sutter's comments at the very beginning. I think strategic ambiguity is still the right approach for the US to take, because I think this state of play coming out of this election has both has some real hazards for the US, for US policy, and for cross-strait relations that are best avoided by continuing to take a somewhat ambiguous and removed approach to Taiwan. So in the legislature, I think there's the increased weight of the KMT, possibly augmented by the sort of kingmaker role of the TPP, puts military spending in some jeopardy. And Taiwan's military spending is a very high priority for the U.S. So we need to continue to encourage Taiwan to go forward with the military spending commitments that it's made in the last 4 years, and not to be kind of taken up with debates about whether the U.S. is reliable, whether the U.S. partnership is a good idea for Taiwan. That's very important. So we don't want to, we want to continue to encourage Taiwan on that front. At the same time, I think Lai Ching-te is a higher risk to the U.S. Than Tsai Ing-wen of missteps that might escalate tensions with the PRC. He has not shown himself to be quite as prudent or disciplined as his predecessor, and has made some comments that have, I think one might argue, unnecessarily inflamed the PRC. This is something that Tsai Ing-wen really didn't do. And so I think the U.S. doesn't want to give a kind of blank check or carte blanche to Lai Ching-te to kind of say whatever he wants, imagining that the U.S. will support whatever he says. So with that, I'll hand it back to Bob.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I think we've had some really good discussion about the implications of what's been happening inside Taiwan, the intricacies of selecting a leader for the legislature, for example, and things of that nature. And looking at the chat, the questions that have been coming have been directly addressed in many cases by the comments of the presenters. In the broader sense, I'm going to start off the questions, and then we'll be open to questions from the group. I'm not sure if, from Amanda's point of view, if I'm supposed to look at the chat and summarize the questions, or how she'd want to proceed on the questions, but I'll leave that to her once I ask this question for discussion. And we've talked about the the situation in the United States briefly, about strategic ambiguity. And it seems that the United States is not prepared to take dramatic action that would complicate the situation greatly, that would add to the tension. Obviously, there's an ongoing effort to improve the capacities in Taiwan to help deter Beijing. But the administration doesn't seem to be moving in a direction that would be provocative. So there's stability there to a degree. Inside Taiwan, we've addressed briefly the constraints that Mr. Lai faces as the leader of the country in doing dramatic things that would provoke China. Obviously, he could do something. It could, as Professor Rigger highlighted, but the inclination to do that is checked by a number of other factors politically inside the country and in the government. He doesn't control the government as much as other leaders, and the inclination to do that seems pretty low from the point of view of the Taiwan electorate. So that leaves us with Beijing. Is Beijing likely to take dramatic action here? And Russell addressed this issue, urging us to wait and to see how this plays out. The inauguration will be in May, and they may wait even beyond that before taking decisive action. Is Beijing deterred from taking action that would be very dramatic and provocative in this situation? The toolkit that they have has been going on for several years. They're following it in different ways. Will they go further? Will they do something more dramatic? And so I'd like to ask the group, ask our speakers to address that issue. do they see elements of instability in the situation in Taiwan, in the situation in the United States, and in the situation in Beijing? Do they see any significant areas of instability that would lead to this kind of danger that many of the criticisms of the U.S. policy have been focused on? The shortcomings of the United States in dealing with these issues, whether it's on the one hand, greater strength for Taiwan, or on the other hand, and preparedness for the United States, on the other hand, reassurance of Beijing. And so this is I think, a very important question right now. And I'd like Russell and Shelley to make some remarks on that, if they would.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Sutter. I apologize. I lost my internet connection earlier at my office, and so I missed a lot of what Professor Riggert had said, and hopefully I'm not repeating anything that she had already commented on. But with regards to your specific questions as to Beijing's perspectives and what it is likely to do, I think Beijing has made its position abundantly clear with regards to the incoming Lai Ching administration. It has warned repeatedly through high-level official statements, through its propaganda outlets, and through its efforts to influence and shape the elections in Taiwan, in essentially framing the election as the consequences of the election as one between war and peace, and it has even gone so far as to sanction, the vice president-elect as well, the former, U.S. representative, the former representative to the United States, Shelby Kim. That she was one of the persons sanctioned by the PRC. So clearly, the PRC does not like the incoming administration, nor did it like, of course, the Taiwan administration. I think it would be, I would find it very hard to believe that any DPP administration would be acceptable to the CCP, and the fact that the PRC has neglected to and failed to communicate and deal with the Tsai Ing-wen administration, whom I think we all on this panel can agree was a very stable and steady hand in managing cross-strait relation at a very tumultuous and turbulent time, as perhaps one of the best interlocutors the CCP could possibly find in dealing with cross-strait tensions, and yet they failed to do so. So what I do expect to see going forward is essentially the intensification of CCP's political warfare activities directed at Taiwan. Its approach to Taiwan has always been a two-pronged approach, one which is sort of essentially a mix of carrots and sticks. And I think, the PRC has indicated that it is going to double down on the sticks with regards to the Lai administration. It will probably push harder and faster. But I don't think, that being said, and let me go through the sort of the toolbox here. And while I laid out, what I saw were the unprecedented scope and the scale and coordination of the various tools that they are utilizing in terms of the political, the economic, and the military, the information and levers in those spaces. There's still a lot more that they can do, and I think we have seen some of those tools on display, and you can, not hard to imagine how, with incremental closer encroachments into Taiwan's maritime zones, to coordinated cyber and information operations, for perhaps from what we've seen in the massive August exercises, where there was a coordinated takedown of both of government websites, to include, information campaigns of hacking bulletins, electronic bulletins in Taiwan, denouncing Speaker Pelosi's visit, that that these types of activities are still, I think, limited in terms of the full suite of capabilities that that the PRC has in its disposal, and especially in the economic realm. And I think the indicators there, at least in the trend lines that we can see from the beginning of the Taiwan's second administration, where there was again a systematic series of import bans, to again this the potential rescission of the economic cooperation and framework agreement, that could really weigh on Taiwan's economic prospects, were it to be completely rescinded, are I think part of a larger toolkit of measures that it will take to push Taiwan, and of course Taiwan into negotiating on terms that is that's agreeable to the People's Republic of China. And I think to some extent, and there are sort of there are competing variables here that that they could become more successful in the future. I've been reading a lot of reports and post-election analysis that this election, simply because President Lai Ching-te, the DPP won the presidential election, that CCP's influence campaign has failed. Now, I think it only has failed if it's measured by, it depends on how the CCP measures it. The fact that the Legislative Yuan has now is part is the plurality of the seats are controlled by the opposition party, with a third party, decisive third party, that in the course of the campaign has indicated a preference for engagement with China, to the continued dissatisfaction overall with the DPP's governance, especially in I think in the context of the Legislative Yuan, could open more avenues by which the CCP can engage in more effective united front strategies. Because let's be clear, with at least in the past 8 years, where the DPP, where the KMT was marginalized in the Legislative Yuan, it made the CCP's United Front activities pushed it far more to the fringes, and so I think, but nevertheless, I think that there are sort of the overall sort of moderating effects of Taiwan's democratization
Russell, thanks very
yeah.
Thanks very much, Russell. Shelley, did you want to respond to this at all? And then we might have some time for a few questions.
Yeah, I would just say really quickly, my concern is less about Lai and more about the U.S. and how gestures intended to show support for Taiwan could actually either entice Lai to make statements or take actions that he otherwise wouldn't, or activate the PRC regardless of what Lai or anyone else in Taiwan is doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you see Beijing being more prone to this as well? Do you see them? I mean, it takes two to tango on this one.
Yeah, I think for example, the reaction to the Nancy Pelosi visit shows that they are particularly sensitive to U.S. actions. And I think they are increasingly concerned about where the U.S. might go. I think the possibility of a Republican administration a year from now, in particular, really worries Beijing because they fear that Republicans may push Taiwan beyond the point at which they can, they really have to take very strong measures, and potentially not because it's, in the interest of Taiwan, but just because it's part of this U.S.-China competition.
Great. We still have some time for questions. Amanda, did you want to lead those? How do we? I've tried to synthesize them from the chat. I've been reading them, and I can synthesize them if that's what you'd like. How should we proceed?
Yeah, well, I wanted to see if Professor Rigger, if you wanted to address, I see that you had briefly answered Adam's question in the chat. If you wanted to add any more detail to those questions.
Yeah, so I think the TPP, a lot of the TPP support seems to have come from young voters. So there's polling evidence for that and other evidence for that. But there are probably only about 1 million in this young voter category, 20 to 29, and Ke received 3 million votes for president. So it's not all young voters, but I think it's very certainly within the discourse in Taiwan, it's strongly believed that young people voted for Ke, and they voted for Ke because of those economic issues that you mentioned in your question, especially high housing prices and stagnant wages. So I do think that both the DPP and the TPP will try to make those issues more prominent in the legislative yuan. The TPP, in order to sustain and grow its support among younger voters, the DPP, in order to recover younger voters who have traditionally been part of the DPP base. It's always hard to do, though, because Taiwan is a fiscally conservative society and electorate. And whenever you're talking about sort of adjusting the levers of capitalism to make things more distributive, that's a hard sell in Taiwan.
Thank you very much.
Did you one question that I saw in the chat, which I thought was alluded to by both Shelley and Russell, was the fact that a majority of voters voted for parties that had a more moderate posture toward the mainland. And what is the significance of that? So that was in two questions raised that issue. So I think that's an important element. And Russell, you indicated that Beijing would take some solace in this, and Shelley, you're talking about these issues as well. So do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, I agree that from the PRC's point of view, the fact that 60% of the electorate did not vote for the DPP is reassuring. Obviously, they would have preferred that those 60% all get together and vote for one candidate so they could actually win. But failing that, I think they will take this as a victory. I think it's more complicated than that. I'm not, and I think a lot of the votes were cast on domestic issues, not cross-strait relations. But the sort of effect is to reduce the level of anxiety in the PRC a little bit.
Russell?
Yeah, I think the implication that I take from the fact that, again, the majority of the voting population in Taiwan voted for parties that represent a more pro-engagement approach to the PRC. To mean that the implication here is that I think for the United States, that in the coming years ahead, it must not isolate and it must engage these opposition parties because and one area that I think is very important to be for Taiwan observers and watchers to pay attention to is whether or not efforts to reform within the KMT is able to continue after this election. Now, after the KMT lost the 2016 elections, there was briefly an effort of the French elements or the darker blue elements within the KMT to gain control of the KMT, but then the establishment wings of the party, reflected by the current chairman, was able to sort of wrestle back control of the party. And I don't think it's necessarily assured whether or not such a that the trend will continue. There are already calls right now within the party for the for the current chairman, Eric Zhu, who represents more of the pro-U.S., factions of the party, to step down, to take responsibility for the election results. And as such, one sort of context point here, though, I think that being said, I do think one interesting sort of observation that I had from this election results is that if you were to look at the geography of Taiwan as a sort of a color spectrum, 10 years, ago, 20 years ago, you can see a very heavy concentration of dark green and dark blue voters in terms of the density of votes with the Pan-Blue coalition in the north and the Pan-Green coalition in the south. And I think what we've seen in the 2024 elections, at least, is that there's a much more there's a lighter density of those votes, meaning it's suggesting that there's a more equal distribution or dilution of those votes in those areas. And I think that suggests that implies to me a sort of more of a moderation and a less polarization of Taiwan's society, and to some extent the issue of the fact that all three candidates, presidential candidates, preferred in their platform indicate a preference for maintaining the status quo is, I think, one further indication of I think the moderating effects of Taiwan's democracy, and I think that's a trend line that bodes well in terms of the resiliency of the Taiwanese people going forward.
Great. Well, Amanda, how are we doing on time?
Yes, it does appear that we are a couple minutes past time, actually. So I wish we could address everything in more detail, but I do think being mindful of everyone's schedules probably be a good time to wrap up. So I do wanted to say thank you very much to you, Dr. Sutter, to Dr. Rigger, and to Mr. Xiao for all speaking at this webinar today. We all greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your perspectives and insights on this really complex and highly relevant topic. And thank you as well to everybody who has tuned in and shared questions in the chat. We really appreciate you fostering this discussion. And although we are out of time now, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with today's speakers, please reach out to us at the U.S. Asia Institute, and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we've discussed today. My email is just amanda.earls@usasiainstitute.org, so feel free to reach out if you'd like any more connections to happen. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.